I need some traction.
Hey everyone, Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Boast AI and Traction. Today's Traction webinar is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy in partnership with Growth Blazers. So excited to have Shama here today. Shama Hyder and I met in Malaysia some 10 years ago. We were both speaking at the Global Entrepreneurship Summit where Barack Obama was there as well. And I was completely enamored by Shama's talk. She is a major influencer in the marketing and tech space. And she's done it all. She's a visionary strategist for the digital age, web and TV personality, best-selling author, and runs this awesome firm called Zen Media. And she's been named one of the top marketers by Entrepreneur Magazine, by Fast Company. And she's been honored at both the White House and the UN as one of the top 100 young entrepreneurs in the country. And the list goes on and on and on and on. I was just watching an interview of Shama with 50 Cent. So that was a good one. And so Shama and I stayed in touch and every now and then. And recently we met at a friends conference in Miami where I was speaking, and I said, I got to have you on the show. So thanks for joining us, Shama. Where are you tuning in from today?
Thanks for having me, Lloyd. And I'm sorry, I keep tweaking my setup because, as I was telling you earlier, my 2.5-year-old has managed to get into the office. And so he loves moving things for mommy. And then when I tell him what he's doing, he says, I'm working. So
That's super cute.
Tuning in for Miami, man. I love your hack. I got to try that sometime. Usually when I'm traveling, it's too fast and I don't get the full benefit of the place.
Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna share some tips and places to go if you do visit Dubai. But the topic for today is the 5 treacherous lies that marketers tell and rules to win the PR game to drive brand and leads, right? 64% of prospects enter the buying cycle before they even speak to sales or sign up for a demo. So as companies, we have to radically change the way we market or we risk losing to competitors. Shama did this talk recently at South by Southwest, and we're going to dive all into it, learn about the treacherous lies that marketers tell and the top PR rules that you can use to win in this market. So Shama, before we dive into today's topic, you've had a super successful career, right? Entrepreneur, marketer, influencer, storyteller. Give us your backstory. How did you get to where you are today?
Oh boy. So thank you, first of all, Lloyd. Great to be here. I love that we've got people from all over the globe joining. So hopefully this will be a great conversation around the way marketing, PR, this world is changing. But I got my start very early days. I graduated from the University of Texas at Austin. I have a master's in organizational communication and technology. And very few people actually know this. I was studying under one of the preeminent scholars on time, believe it or not, time and communication. So a lot of interesting things around that now with work from home and so forth. But I was fascinated by social media in general at large. I thought, man, this is going to change the world. I know you said that I just spoke at South by, which I did. They did my keynote. But the first time I attended South by was in 2008. So super early days. That was the year actually Interactive had just launched. So there were 200 of us. And I know pre-COVID, the numbers were like 20,000 plus at Interactive. So you could just see how much that's changed in that short amount of time. And as a grad student in Austin and Texas, I actually did my thesis on Twitter when it had about 2,000 users. So super early days. People would say, what's Twitter? Facebook is something my kids use. I mean, social media was just not even, a blip on the radar, if you will, but I was passionate about it. I thought this is really going to be a game changer. And I found especially a lot of interest in small businesses at the time to say, if this helps get customers in the door, we're game. And so that's how I got my start, more from academia. And then, being 22 when I started my company, which is now Zen Media, I find the most fascinating thing is that, and I tell people this, if you're starting a company, your best friend is a bit of naivete. And I'm grateful that I had a lot of naivete starting out. So very naive about a lot of things, but it's good. I think it works in your favor because if someone as a founder or as an entrepreneur tells you the entire road you have ahead of you and every challenge possible, I think it can be daunting. So that's how I got my start, and couldn't get a job, got out of school. Nobody understood what social media was, and I don't say that I don't say that lightly. It was a lot of companies left and right rejected me and just didn't see that had any potential to change how business was done, communications were conducted, and so forth. So again, I'm talking really early days. And so, at 22, I have a choice. I can either change my career trajectory into something that maybe I was less passionate about, but had more broader appeal, or I put my own shingle out there. So I thought, self-employed sounds good. and I did, I had a lot of demand again from small businesses at the time when we started out to say, if this gets customers in our door, we're game. Remember, this was 2008, 2009. So giant recession looming, right? Biggest thing to hit the US since the Great Depression. So there was just a lot of hunger in small businesses to say, how can we use this? How can, we're game to try anything that helps. And so those are my roots. That's how I got started. And then just grew from there. And then a few years later, many of those companies that were not very interested in the world of social media came knocking. And yeah, man, I mean, much of the story after that, but haven't looked back. Grown Zen Media, we passed 1 million in revenue in the first 3 years. I share a lot of my story too, because I feel like I get a very unique perspective, of perhaps a very different perspective into marketing and PR than other people have, because I came from academia, and then at 22, I didn't have any connections, any network. I think it was 6 years after starting my agency that I even realized that most people start their agencies, they have a book of business, they start at a corporate job, and then they transfer over, right? I didn't know any of that. So again, my naivete helped. I only knew what I was passionate about, what I was good at. I feel like my skill set's pretty limited, but this is one of the things that it's rather limited to. So yeah, man, so that's how I got my start. And we grew. We went from doing social media to earned. So today we do a lot of PR, content, social. Those are our 3 main buckets. And we work predominantly with tech and B2B companies. So a lot of expertise there, and kind of seeing what's actually working in the trenches.
Definitely, the great story. And I remember our first meeting and being just as impressed as I am today. But PR today is very different than PR yesterday, right? And so let's dive into that. Firstly, what does PR today mean, and why is it not the PR of yesterday? I had a great chat with HubSpot CMO not too long ago, and he said something to me which stuck. He said brands of yesterday were built on what they told the world they were, and brands of tomorrow, brands of the future, will be built on what the biggest influencers say about them. So that is one data point.
That's a great data point. And I'll take it a little bit even further when I say, when it used to be what does your brand say about you, right? What do we stand for? What do we want people to connect our brand to? And I really think in the realm of social media, sort of broader world, in this digital age that we live in today, it's much more, what does doing business with you allow people to say about their personal brand? And so this was one of my key learnings when I was actually looking at social media under the academic lens microscope, was realizing, why do people even engage? Why do people like the brands that they like? Lets them say something about themselves. It makes them feel like they're smarter, that they're cooler, they get to share something with their friends. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Brands and brand building has changed dramatically. But if you let's just look at PR alone, so much of PR used to be traditional press and analysts, right? Like the Gartners, the Forresters, blah, blah, blah. And today, oh man, it's changed so much. First of all, I think PR and marketing have to play together. Part of the reason people say is, oh, you guys do PR and marketing. And say our roots are in marketing, because with PR, it's great, you get a placement and then what? Or understanding that today's influencer or contributor may be a great podcast host. It may be someone, with a lot of influence on YouTube or TikTok, whatever it is. These are not always traditional journalists. And so the types of things that we do, I think sometimes surprise people, because it's not traditional PR. It's Twitter Spaces, it might be LinkedIn Fireside Chats, it may be, a product hunt launch campaign, stuff like that really moves the needle for especially B2B companies. And I think this is kind of PR of the future, if not now, connecting those dots. One of the things I find fascinating is how divorced PR is often from sales. Like for sales folks, sales teams, the biggest kind of the thing that they need most is to be able to like close, right? To be able to nurture these leads that they have and close. But PR is awesome for that, but they often have no idea. Like they don't know what placements they've even gotten, much less how to use that when they're engaging people in conversations. So I do think B2B tends to be so much more product and sales focused, but it's a huge missed opportunity because every company is product and sales focused, right? Like it's, and one of the things we absolutely know to be true is, look, the best product doesn't win. And I think this is sometimes what breaks my heart is when I meet companies that have a better product than their competitors and they worked harder at it, but because the competitor is perceived to be better because they have more market share. In psychology, this concept is called mere exposure. The more we're exposed to something, the more affinity we have for it, the more we tend to trust it. And so just because of that, those brands are winning, right? And so I feel like there's an obligation for every underdog out there that has a cool company that does something neat to be able to take advantage of it and make sure that people know what's what.
Definitely. Folks, as we're going through the conversation, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A. Recordings will be on our YouTube and Spotify, so subscribe and hit the bell. So one thing's really interesting, right? Today, back in the day or a few years ago, PR was all about, let's say, tech, get on TechCrunch or VentureBeat. And those are just blips. It's hard to manufacture stories very consistently unless you have those stories coming up, right? It's hard to be authentic and keep manufacturing stories. But what you said is great. You got to sort of figure out where your audience eats, breathes, drinks, and sleeps, where your audience hangs out. And based on that, create a 360 strategy, which incorporates a little bit of social, or if it's podcasts, like figuring out where they hang out and then being in that cycle constantly versus just looking for that TechCrunch blip. Now, you talked a little bit about digital selling, right? Like sales people need to just close. And then you also talk about digital selling and digital marketing. What is the difference? What is digital selling and what is the difference between digital selling and digital marketing?
Such a great question, Lloyd. And what I'm fascinated by, like this blows my mind, is how many companies today, especially in the B2B realm, focus and think that marketing is really selling. Like there's just such confusion around it. What I mean by this is, look, even 10 years ago, when you needed leads, when you needed to get like contact information, you needed marketing to do it, right? You needed it required a lot more robustness than it does today. But today you really don't need marketing to get you contact information. Like there's databases, like anyone can help you pull good contact information. There's research, there's so much stuff out there. So that's a lot of the way marketing is treated right now. So let's start there. I think that'll help, is almost as an on-demand collateral center for sales. So it's like sales needs this, marketing go get it. Sales needs it. But really, marketing's job needs to be creating the right setup, brand building, which is, I feel like the bad word in marketing is like the B word, is you don't say brand. But creating this community, I mean, a lot of what you're doing, look at traction with these webinars and Boast, right? That is right out of the playbook. That's good marketing because it goes around community. It's about creating value. It's about creating your footprint out there. And I urge companies to think about marketing almost more like they do R&D. Right? Most people don't think about marketing as R&D because they're like, I want quick, I want like right away. And not that that's a bad thing. I often said that good marketing is a privilege. Like you have to be at a certain point in the business where you can start engaging in these sorts of activities. But when you are there, it's a shame not to deploy this, because I call this the Jaguar effect. And the Jaguar effect, if you've heard of the, if you've heard of stories of the jaguar attacking, a lot of what it does is it waits. A lot of what a jaguar does in the animal kingdom is it perches and it waits for the right opportunity and it tracks its prey. And when that opportunity happens, it's super fast and pounces and then polishes off the prey. What's really interesting is marketing is very much like that. If you are ready, if you're doing everything right, and look at the pandemic, it showed us this in spades. The companies that really suffered were the ones that were completely dependent on trade shows. They're doing the same stuff. They hadn't it's just marketing constantly playing defense, right? Oh, something's wrong, have marketing fix it. Something's got versus companies that were really proactive. They weren't just selling, they were actually marketing, they were building runway, they were building brand equity, they were creating community, they were using PR, they were connecting with these influencers. These are the companies where you see moments like that, and that gives them just phenomenal ROI. It gives them such a great return. And we saw this with our clients, and the clients that were willing to take advantage of the moment and say, how can we be there for our community? How can we do, how can we do the right thing? How can we, everything that we've built, that's the moment. And I think so many people are very short-sighted about marketing and PR, and that's a lot of what we see.
Definitely. So let's dive into some of this, right? So where does somebody start with PR? Say you're a startup, you've gotten happy customers, you've gotten to product market fit, meaning people are not churning. I think the worst time to spend on marketing is when you don't have product market fit and you have high churn and you haven't figured out how to keep your customers. But if you have happy customers, let's say you have 10, 20 happy customers, and now you're thinking through marketing, how do I pour fuel on the fire, get more customers? PR can be a great asset. I mean, we've been, like Bose has been on TechCrunch, on Forbes, on Fortune. We got a huge blitz last year, and then layered it on with podcasts and conference appearances and whatnot. And it's done very well for us. But say you're a small startup, no funding or little funding, where do you start and how much do you spend? Like, what are the key strategies to think through here?
Yeah, great question, Lloyd. And I will say this, PR, when I talk about good marketing being a privilege and whatnot, this is all amplifying. This is all amplifying stuff. So if you hit this nail on the head, you've got to have product market fit. So you don't want to start doing PR when you're right at it, unless, now I will say this, it's a different strategy when a company has a series that they've closed and they're looking to create that, get that next series closed. Then I think PR, you've got to prioritize it even more because it plays a key role with your perception, the way investors see it. Look, everybody wants to invest in something that's hot. PR is a great way to start telling that story, to start building that buzz. And so I think the strategy slightly differs there. If you're like, hey, I need to get investors, or we've gotten investors and now we need to tell our story a lot better. So I just want to make that distinction. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. You make sure your product market fit, you have happy customers. This is all the stuff that we're talking about. It's sizzle to the steak, but you can't reverse engineer that. And so, when I talk to prospects or clients, I tell them, I'm like, listen, we're really good when you have substance. We can add sizzle, but you can't reverse engineer that. So when you're starting out your company, you want to make sure that you have substance, that you have steak, that you really spend the time to start to cultivate that community, that you start to you want to make sure you're telling the story when it's the right time for the story to be told to some degree, right? I personally have always done PR, even when and this is where I said, a lot of the things that I'm talking about, it's not theoretical. Like, this is how I built my own company. And so I started 22 years old. I had $1,500. Like, I no network, nothing, right? Like, pretty much the internet, my passion, and knowing what I know. Like, that's really all I had. And so this is the same playbook that I followed to build Zen. And even in our first years, clients would tell us, like, wow, you guys, punch way above your weight online. And, we're a company that's been around for 100 years and we don't have a quarter of your digital footprint, which to me was the ultimate compliment, right? So part of it is you're never too early to start building out your digital footprint in that way. But if you're looking for PR or even the marketing done right, to be quick returns, meaning like, hey, we're getting in Fortune, great, or we're getting in Venture Beat. We have clients in these publications all the time. Okay, so we got into Venture Beat. Why don't we have 100 demo requests the next day? So not understanding how PR works, I think is one of those critical errors. And so if you are really starting out and you're like hunting to kill, like you're hunting to get food on the table the next day, PR is not your best bet, because it's not what's going to get you, advertising. By all means, advertise, get your conversions up, so forth. But this is not what drives the instant results. Heck, you could land on the homepage of New York Times and you wouldn't see that sort of thing, because the way people even buy today has changed so dramatically. And I think that's what people don't realize. Like, most companies sell as if people are buying the way they did 10, 15, even 20 years ago. Now, when you ask them questions like, how do you buy? They're like, oh yeah, this is how I buy. But when they think of their prospects, right, they have a whole different mentality of how they think they're buying. Google actually did this amazing research project. By the way, I think like Google, Microsoft, all these companies, they spend millions of dollars in research, and it's great to take advantage of that because you can learn so much. One of the things that Google looked at was, how do people actually buy? And they found this fascinating, they did this fascinating study around the messy middle, like the way something might, start off a conversation. It might be a trigger buying point. And then they go through evaluation, and then they go through, looking at different things, and they're kind of in this loop, and then they purchase. But around all of this miasma that we're talking about, this constant exposure to a brand, that's really what gets them at the end of the day. And so you have to realize that PR, all these social, all these things, this is how your buyers are buying. The hardest part of all of this is that you can't track all of it. And I will say it right here. It is only going to get harder and harder to track. It really is. I urge people to think about social media as two separate things. There's social and there's media. And something I've been talking about since 2016 has been this idea of dark social, the way people make choices, the way people make relationships. It is so different. Lloyd, I can guess right now what the number one app on your phone is. You want me to guess?
Yes, take a guess.
Okay. My guess is that it's some sort of messaging app. So it's either
100%.
Messenger, and I bet that's true for everybody listening or watching, right? It's some sort of messenger app. Who sees your messages? Hopefully just like you and the person you're conversing with. This is where so many decisions get made. They get made in Slack, LinkedIn messages, text messages, right? They don't get made like people think, oh, I can see where they're. No, you don't get to see where people are going. So many of these decisions get made like this, yet we continue to market as if we have full visibility. And then people say, oh no, but I can look. My software tells me people come from Google. How many times do you type something that you don't remember the URL for, or it's just faster because you can Google it and go to the website, right? All the freaking time happens. Why does that happen? Because Google used to be, search engines in general used to be like the starting point. It's where you start your process of research. Now, more than half the times, it's just the gateway. You know where you're trying to go, but you type it into Google anyways. Versus going to the URL bar and typing it in, you just type it into your homepage search screen. But now the company looking at it is saying, oh, look at that. So-and-so came from Google or search. But it's not really search. It's all the stuff happening behind the scenes that you don't get to see.
Definitely. People are talking. And if you go back to even the HubSpot CMO, Kip Bodner's comment is like, brands of tomorrow will be built on community, will be built on what the influencers and the community says about you. So let's dive in. What is that playbook? Because you guys got a massive digital footprint. What are the key ingredients of creating a PR and digital footprint here, a successful one, which helps you win market share?
Yeah, so I will say across this board, right? Regardless of industry, whatnot, it's value, it's consistency, it's time. It's value delivered consistently over time. It's not the sexy answer that people want to hear, but it's the honest answer. And that's why I say good marketing is a privilege, because the company that's trying to make payroll next week or their next payroll is not the company that should be looking at PR and marketing seriously, because they can't. They're looking for things that'll quickly fill the holes. But for the companies that are looking for like the thing that gives them the hockey stick result or something that totally blows the competitors out of the water, that's when marketing and PR really come to play. So I think it's understanding where you are as a company, what your playbook needs to be, and then also realizing that it takes a village to execute on these things. I think the other fallacy and why so many people lose good in-house marketers is expecting them to do too much. Like one person can't design and develop and write copy and it's just not feasible, because it's not the way, it's not the way even talent works. Forget, nurturing skill sets, but and so much of what's required in, let's say, like, let's take this example, Lloyd. You're recording this, right? We're doing this live, but then someone on your team takes this with some technical skill, I imagine, cuts it up. Someone's got to pull that audio, make sure it's clean and it goes on the podcast. Someone's got to make sure there's clips for social. Okay, it's clips for social. Now we need a good caption so people actually watch this stuff. So there's a lot of different skill sets. So I think it is also making sure that you have the right team in place, you have the right playbook, the right framework in place. And then, that you're just doing it consistently over time. So many people stop way sooner than, like, you look at the best brands, look at Coca-Cola, right? And I use Coca-Cola because I feel like it's such a ubiquitous brand. They spend $4 billion in advertising every year. $4 billion. Why? If everybody already knows Coca-Cola and it's got such market share, why do it? Eh? And so it's because they realize that they have to keep doing it. It's how they continue to keep market share. It's how they continue to, they've got great history, so it goes in their favor. But I think it's just really telling that a company that has those resources and that market share keeps going. Why spend so much? And so I think it's very important also to look and learn and see what are others who have more resources, better capabilities sharing out there, and why are they doing that way? And I think I've always been very curious about that.
Yeah, and when we were thinking about it, right, I've been a part of a couple of venture-backed failures. And so when we started Boast, which automates funding for startups and innovators, we started with who's your ideal customer. And for us, it was founders, CEOs of technology companies, innovators, and then figuring out where do they eat, breathe, drink, and sleep. And so we just drew that out. Who is your ideal customer profile? Founder, CEO, technology company that is growing, right, in the US and Canada. And we're like, who do they fund? Meaning what tools and everything they pay for? Who do they frequent? Meaning what events, etc., do they go to, and who do they follow? Who are the influencers? Who are the press? Who's maybe it's other CEOs, etc. And we made lists of those, and then we started with one thing. And you said this right. Success is really doing one thing consistently well over time, right? And so we started doing pizza nights, and those pizza nights, every time 20, 30, 40, 50 people came. And one day it got to 200 people, and our co-working space said, you can't do this anymore here. And so we started with a conference. And again, taking that framework, who do they fund? Who do they follow? Who do they frequent? And we're like, who do they follow? They follow TechCrunch and VentureBeat, et cetera, and all these big name VCs and CEOs. So we started cold emailing all of them, and we invited the media to interview them, and we started hosting events. And that enabled us to build relationships with the media and these people. And then, of course, the content that followed, we turned into YouTube and podcasts now. And then, when you have one, you get the social proof to keep doing many. But a lot of people get fixated on the success of that one. And then sort of, even if it's mediocre or not super successful, they stop, right? And the key is to do it consistently. We also had this idea of, hey, if the pandemic hit, maybe we should do a 2-day virtual conference. And we said, hey, I can't sit through a 2-day virtual conference myself, but all this, we got like 54 speakers. We can ask all of them to do an hour-long webinar every week. And that gave us content, and it turned into 2 a week. So for us, it was stemming from that ideal customer profile, and then sort of where do they all engage, and trying to sort of dominate that and build a sphere, but with dominate the sphere around them. But with you, with Zen Media, when you started, and some of your customers that are early on, how do you guys, like, maybe you can walk through a sample case study without taking names?
Yeah. So you mean walk you through how we approach marketing, how we approach
Yeah,
PR
how you approach PR and earned for a company that, say, just hit product market fit. Like, what would be the building blocks of what you would do to get them a digital footprint?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's really fascinating. So part of it is really understanding their story, right? Sometimes founders have great stories and origin stories, and so looking at, again, to your point, who are the influencers in their market space? Because part of that is most of the clients that we work with either A, want it for demand gen, they want to be able to use it to, grow their companies. Two, they're investors, like they're looking to attract. We just helped two clients close their Series D, or if they're preparing for IPO, whatever, those types of clients, to sort of different strategy that you have to keep in mind. And then three is, of course, this time and point, especially recruiting, like how do they tell their story so they get the best engineers to work for them, they get people who want, and it's the same thing, right? People want to work for a name that's known. Everybody wants, and I can't stress this enough, visibility creates opportunity. It's just the truth. And so part of what you're talking about, Lloyd, with the pizza nights and conferences, not only are you creating that visibility, but you're creating opportunities for luck to happen, right? Which is, so you want to get luckier, hang out with more people, because without people, there is no luck. Luck doesn't occur in a vacuum. So that sounds like exactly what you're doing. You're hosting the party, you're inviting people in, and as host, there's certain perks to that. You do have to be consistent. It's not a one-off thing. So back to your question, helping our clients figure out what that looks like, and then going after the platforms. So this is the other kind of misconception in PR. And a lot of people will say, like, doesn't matter who you know. And I'm like, yes and no. Yes, it matters who you know, because it's the difference between someone taking your call and not taking your call. Like, and as inundated as the press is, it does make a difference. It makes a difference if you have a track record with them, giving them solid, clients. Look, at the end of the day, they need the help too. They're stretched thin. They've got lots going on, or helping, even understanding with their clients, who are their influencers? What kinds of things can be set up, whether it is webinars, whether it is different types of earned media content, which then you expand. So I'll give you a very specific example. Forbes 8 was one of our clients when the pandemic hit. And, one of the things that we pitched them and said, let's do a conference. I think that could be really great, much to what you're talking about, because South by that year got canceled, if you'll remember. And I said, all these great speakers at South by, which I knew many of them personally, was like, they had their talks ready for South by. Now it's not happening. This audience is still hungry. Guess what? It also happens to be your audience. Why don't we have these speakers and talk about, how people can be resilient during this time? So that's what we did. And we pulled this together in 2 weeks. And the amount of, not just the people who signed up for it, but the amount of press that event got beat anything that they'd done offline across the board. Like, in their history, they never got as much press, because it was right timing. It was playing, and this is a lot of what good PR is. And this is where founders don't know, because it's not their job to know, but you have to connect it to what's happening in the world, right? What are the things that are trending? How can you tie your message into what makes sense? So one of our clients is a really cool fintech SaaS company called Nearside, and they offer, there's a neo bank more or less for creators. Well, creator economy just happens to be very hot right now. What do creators need? How can we better support them? And here's a new type of, financial platform that really helps cater to that audience. And so it is about connecting those dots and figuring out what's happening in the greater ethos that ties really well into your brand. So, part of this is a little bit of a, I don't know what you'd call it, like communication jiu-jitsu or social jiu-jitsu. So it's a combination of those things. And hopefully that's helped answer a bit of your question, in that, the strategies is a little bit different. The other thing I'll tell the entire, everyone listening or watching here is, do not be stuck up about press. I cannot tell you this enough. People will say, oh, that's a small reporter. That's a small podcast. There are no small reporters. There are no small podcasts, especially in today's day and age. The other day, I talked to a reporter who was working for this publication I've never heard of, Lloyd. I don't know. She just needed a source. I was more than happy to help. I talked to her. At the end of the conversation, she tells me, oh, by the way, I also write for CNBC. So if you ever have content, let me know. And this happens more often than not. I have a reporter at NPR who, has now used me for multiple stories because I helped her out when she was at a much smaller platform that not many people had heard of. And so this kind of old adage of be nice to everyone really applies to media, because that media landscape is changing so fast. So when you get those opportunities, don't turn your nose up at any one of them, because I promise you it works. One of our clients just told me they were in meeting with one of their clients, or in a client they're trying to close a deal with. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I was wrapping up this podcast. And the colleague of the client said, oh, what podcast? He told her, and she said, oh, I love that podcast. I listen to it all the time. So immediately, right, this meeting is off to a better start. So these are the types of things that you're really looking for. You want your brand to be ubiquitous. You want multiple people talking about this brand at the same time. And that's when you really start to see the returns hit.
Definitely. And a lot of founders, they isolate press to getting in TechCrunch or VentureBeat. And I think there's a lot of truth to building relationships. If you guys ever get the chance, read this book called Influence by Robert Cialdini and How to Win Friends and Influence People. They're one of the first two books I ever read. And they were instrumental in my growth. But the way I look at it is, again, coming back to who is your ideal customer? Who do they fund? Who do they frequent? Who do they follow? Where do they eat, breathe, drink, sleep? And it's not about just getting an article in there, but it's about what podcasts do they listen to? What blogs do they read? What magazines do they read? What events do they go to? And then you can say, hey, can I get a speaking slot there? Can I get a podcast appearance there? Can I get a guest article somewhere? Or can I get a quote somewhere? Can I comment around that? And all of those things sort of build your portfolio as a I guess portfolio of influence, right? And then you can use that to leverage a lot of what I still do. And I have like maybe 24 speaking engagements between podcasts and conferences this year. But I cold email a lot of people still, right? I'll leverage that. I'll write a cold email. I'll send an outbound email to them and say, hey, I've been featured on X, Y, and Z. I'd love to know what it takes to be on your show. These are the topics I can talk about. And I link, and it's basically brand rub, right? The social proof you create gets you more social proof, and you got to start from somewhere, and you're constantly leveling up. So I love that you shared. No journalist is a small journalist. You can always keep leveling up. Now, you have this 95-5 rule. What is that?
So this isn't my rule, by the way. This is just to clarify, but I do believe in it so strongly, and I wish more people understood it. The 95-5 rule actually came about from the LinkedIn Institute's research. Again, LinkedIn, another Microsoft-owned company, but they have such amazing research. They spend millions of dollars, multi-millions of dollars on creating. So we think you can really learn a ton and see where the industry is going at large. One of the things that they shared is this 95-5 rule, which simply says that only 5% of your target market is ready to buy at any given time, right? 95% are not there yet for whatever it is you offer. They're not buying. So it doesn't matter how hard you try to sell to that 95%, they're not there. So your marketing really needs to focus on the 95%. Your sales can focus on the 5%. Those are the people that are actively in the market. They're already looking to buy. It's a different process. The 95%, what you want is that when they are ready to buy, they think of you first. And that is where I think smart companies focus so much, because it's not going to be like someone's not going to need your platform every day or whenever. It might be triggered by something. It may be a life event. It may be something they need for work, whatnot. But you want them to think of you. You want to be in the running. And so for so many companies that I see, even the ones that have a little bit of attention or buzz, they don't have a seat at the table. They're not the things that are, people think of. And I think this idea, again, going back to sort of dark social, how many people talk about what you're doing that you don't have access to, I think is so powerful. And so, Lloyd, it's funny because I've seen traction. I mean, you and I met in Malaysia all those years ago, but I've seen traction multiple times since, but you didn't know it each time that I had a touch point, right? So I've had people share it in our Slack channel. I've had someone share it in an email. Like, these are all dark channels. And so when you're like, hey, let's do a webinar, I say, of course, like, this is awesome, because the Traction brand has really, like, the brand is already cemented in my mind, but it's not necessarily through every touch point that you can see. And so I think that's an important aspect to just kind of remember.
Definitely. And so that's a really good point you make, right? Like 95% of the people are not ready to buy. And a lot of, especially in the B2B space, once you have that buyer, there's a lot of tools out there like Outreach and Zoom Info, et cetera, that you can build these lists of companies that you want to reach out to. And I think where people stop is they just start and stop at the direct outreach. Let's send them outbound emails to close them now. But so much of it is like dating. You don't go to a bar and meet somebody and optimize to marry them, right? You optimize for the number and then the text and the next date and the next date. Like, customers go through this cycle with you. They're sort of in this journey, and you got to map out what is that customer's journey and how do you make them successful beyond your product or service. And that may be delivering them content, sending them emails, basically dominating the sphere so they're constantly hearing about you. And so when they are ready to buy, they only think of you and not somebody else. So you've said that very beautifully here. Now, you talked a bunch about getting a seat at the table. What are some tactics you've seen, and what does that even mean, getting a seat at the table, and how do you move beyond like all this attention to get a seat at the table?
Yeah, so seat at the table is when you're considered a serious contender. So let's say it's a SaaS platform, and the company is looking at different SaaS platforms that they need. Like, let's say it's a CRM platform that you sell. You don't just want them to know of you. You want to be one of their top choices in the running, if not the only choice, right? If you've done it right, they already know, like, I want a CRM. We're going to go with these guys because, and Gartner has, again, amazing research on this, but they show that 64% of people are already through the buying cycle before they ask to talk to a salesperson. Most people don't want to talk to a salesperson. They want to do their own homework. They do their own homework. When someone comes for a demo, it's because they've already done a lot of their homework. You already have a seat at the table. Sometimes you work with clients and they were against the big dogs. They're going up against Accentures and Deloitte's, and so again, they might have a better team, they may have better things, but they need companies to think of them in that same bracket. Now, you've got to think about, you've got to get very creative because those are well-known names. So how do you create that same punch, if you will, using, digital, using PR? And this is why I say consistency and time, they're very underrated, because it's not about the one TechCrunch article. Can you get that? Yeah, sure. I mean, look, we do this stuff all the time. You can get profiles in Forbes and your story in Inc. And you get, like, these are all very doable things. The thing is to continuously be out there, to continuously build that exposure, to have that story told. So again, when investors are looking, when your prospects are saying, hey, who do we do business with, that you actually are invited to that. And that's the cool thing. You do start to see more invitations. You see things for, conferences, Lloyd. Like, I know you said cold emails, but how many, I know for a fact you get tons of invites yourself. A lot of them you got to turn down because of schedules and whatnot. I know how that goes, but that you now start to get invited, right? So those are the metrics that you kind of look for too, is that people are seeking out your opinion on cybersecurity, on finance, on tech, like whatever it is that you do in your niche. That's what people start coming to you for. And that includes media, and it includes, consumers. So that's a different story. It's not just attention for the sake of it. It's not just creating, a little, like a bang of, cool, like high five everybody in the office because you got this hit, but really something greater than that. And being able to just keep that going. A brand that I admire, that I think has done a really great job, is Yeti, which is a consumer brand of coolers. But you think about it, they sell coolers, man. That's like the most commoditized thing ever. Coolers and, and like water bottles, camping equipment, but their strategy is so smart. I mean, they've really gone after influencers. They look at like every barbecue pitmaster in Texas and make sure they have a relationship with them. Like to your point, knowing who their audience is, creating value for them, and they definitely play the long game. And so it's really interesting because once you start to get, pardon the pun, but traction around what you're doing, now that itself becomes a story. Do you see what I'm saying? Like that alone,
Definitely.
now you use that part to tell the greater story. So much around like Zappos, another great example. It stopped being about what they did a long time ago. It's about how they've influenced and the story and how good they got at telling that story. So that alone has given them so, legs and perception. Same with Southwest Airlines. Some of these brands that I think people have positive affinity for, it's just because they've gotten so good at telling their stories and making sure that other people, making it easy for other people to kind of perpetuate those stories as well.
Yeah, and a lot of people need to just move beyond the one hit and see how you can play the long game to continuously create influence for your audience. Like for us, I didn't realize this, but like Traction brought in our investors, helped us recruit key people. Investors listen to things, right? Like especially if it's a podcast or a conference or series focused on entrepreneurs. And so then I get hit up with that. But it could be any industry. You may have zero influence, but that doesn't mean, just because you don't have influence doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. And if you have an opinion, creating even something as simple as, say you decide to create a podcast on your own because nobody's inviting you. But now you then go and build a list of who are all the influencers on that topic and you interview them very consistently. Maybe you have to create a list of 1,000 and cold email them, and you may get like 50. And that 50 then becomes content, and you can leverage that social proof to find more people, and then slice the video for YouTube and the audio for podcasts. And then you get all this content that can be turned into blog posts, small, medium, large, snippets for different channels, like wherever your audience engage on. And then you can turn the bigger thing into an ebook behind a paywall. There's so many ways to slice the same content. And when you do enough of it consistently, then you start, like you said, getting invited. Like people are now saying, oh, these guys are influencers. You leverage that social proof to get in different places. There's a lot of things you can do, but you got to start somewhere and do it very, very consistently, like you said. Right?
Funnily enough, when the last time I was in Dubai, I was actually part of this think tank, and I was speaking for this event that they were looking at like the future of tech. Like what is the future of Dubai look like? What does the future of cities look like? Which was really fascinating because it's not my direct alley, right? Like I'm not a tech futurist, but just because of what I do, I tend to have such strong opinions or thoughts, and I know I can see where things are headed just because I have so many data points coming in at any given moment. I also love what you said, Lloyd. I think sometimes people say like, I'm just starting out. I built my personal brand right when I was starting out. You use what you have. At that time I was like, I'm young. How many people see entrepreneurship for young people only became sexy in the last like 5 years. When I was starting out, it wasn't that way at all. And so I made Business Week's 25 under 25 list. I was like, that's my card right now. I will play that. I'm a young entrepreneur. I'm starting out. And so I said, that's the story I shared. Now we're at a different point. It's a different story. It doesn't mean the other wasn't just as authentic, but you have to start where you are. And look, I also tell people it's time or money. When you're starting out, hopefully you got more time than money, because otherwise you're in trouble. And then you use that time to do the things you're talking about. When as you grow a company and you have more money and resources, or that's where people raise rounds, let's be honest. So they have more resources, which then they can deploy people, right, on their behalf to do these things. Look, some of my first clients I got, I had nothing. I mean, like literally no book, no network. The internet isn't even what it was today, where it's so easy to find people and DM them and so forth. I went to Blog World. I still remember Blog World New Media Expo. It was so small. This whole world was so small back then. And I attended this conference and I went to all these sessions and I took notes because that was the only thing as a college student I was good at, right? Like I was like, I can take good notes. And then after I took my notes, I would stand up and I would ask like who wanted a copy of my notes for that session. And people would give me their business cards so I could send them those notes. And so it doesn't matter where you are, there's a way for you to start creating value. Even if you decide, you're going to pitch a reporter, you want to invite someone, make sure that you're like, if you have people that people want to listen to, they have a long list of people asking for their attention and time. Make sure there's something worthy there. Like someone who comments on my LinkedIn all the time, if they ask me something, I'm much more likely to say yes than if someone messages me cold, right? Like I don't know who this person is. I don't necessarily feel that same level of obligation. Now, Lloyd, when you ask me, again, it's different. So when you've got to build those relationships, a lot of times when you work with PR firms and whatnot, that's what you're paying for. Not that they can guarantee those stories or that's all it takes, but it certainly helps because, again, it's a difference between someone taking your call and engaging with you and giving you real feedback versus someone who's like, okay, just one more person emailing me that I don't know.
It's a lot of relationships, right? Relationships transcend companies. Another thing that you said early on in this conversation was visibility is very important. And I look at it as visibility when you're starting out, visibility, credibility, and then profitability. You got to be very visible. Eventually it's like a funnel. It makes you credible if you're saying things on a topic and see if you keep saying the same thing over and over again across 100 different places, it becomes a truth. And then you start making money. You can't just jump to the money on the first try, right? Like another great example of content marketing you gave is you going to all these conferences and taking notes and taking business cards in exchange for sharing those notes. And people can do that. You can collect, there's so much content out there. You can put it behind a paywall and promote it to people and get access, right? So there's many ways to build that influence. Now I want to talk about, shift gears here. You've seen and help craft thousands of different pitches. How do you craft a winning pitch if you're reaching out to the media, let's say for a fundraise or a specific announcement? And how should people think about it? Like, what is press worthy and how do you craft a winning pitch?
Yeah. So if you're working with a great team, trust them because they know what's going to appeal to one reporter versus another. I'll kind of start with what not to do. So I had a founder not too long ago who got multiple introductions to me through different people that I knew. So I thought that was interesting, right? Like, because every time you ask for that, you're kind of cashing in a little bit of your social collateral. So here she asked 3 high-profile people for my information. She got connected to me. Also, she could say, like, I have this company. I've got, can I have your email? I'll pitch you. And I'm like, okay. So I gave her my email. Again, she didn't need to go through that route. Then I get an email from her pitching me on something that I don't write about. This was, I think her product was some consumer goods. I think it was like a new type of diaper for kids or something similar that I'm not 100% on right now. But I was like, this is not, I cover marketing, tech. This is such a different beat, but I'm a mom. So I do at some point cover certain things that are children related. But her pitch was it was like, here's what I want. Here's what I'm looking for. I would love a profile and blah, blah, blah. And then she CC'd her PR person who I never heard from. And that was it. No follow-up, nothing. But I was just it was kind of astonishing because there was so much social capital used to get an introduction to me. And then I got this more or less cold pitch. And it was, you've got to be when you're pitching people, you also have to recognize they're very busy. They don't owe you anything. There's no obligation to them. Like, there's no obligation on them to write for you. Like, even if you think this is your job, you're a journalist, doesn't work that way. Most journalists are inundated, right? They're short on editing staff. They're short on everything. So many times when we write or we pitch a journalist, we do all the heavy lifting for them. I mean, we have a whole content department that'll put together stuff and say, here you go. Like, this is, make it as easy for them as possible. Most founders don't have the time or patience. So you do have to make sure that if you are going to pitch directly, that you spend some time understanding what they write about, how they write, and know that, like, there's no, and you've got to add some value to them too. Like, everyone thinks their story is the best, but this reporter gets 100, my story is the best. So again, showing them that you understand their audience, that, you appreciate their time. Part of it is you've got to be humble. I mean, they're doing you the favor. Yes, in a way you're helping them do their job, but they can write about a lot of different things. And just being a helpful resource. I think this is so important. We had a client that got VentureBeat. Speaking of, they did a interview with a journalist that ended up only using like, 2 lines of what they said because the editor cut so much. But the journalist was so grateful and was like, I'm so sorry. And, said, no problem. Happy to help with the story. Glad what you got, what you wanted. A month later, the same journalist ends up writing a much different story, uses them as their premier source because he felt bad that, last time he'd taken up time and couldn't deliver. So like these human principles of reciprocity are still in play. So it goes a long ways to be a good human being, help them do their job better. And in turn, guess what? They too want to help you. They understand that you are trying to get your story out there. So it is a very symbiotic relationship in that way. And Lloyd, I will say this, it was interesting what you shared. People think they have to be, they have to create all this content, whatnot. But I always tell people being a creator is only one way to leverage social media. You can be a curator, you can be a connector. The curation part is so great. I mean, so much of what you're doing here is you're creating content, but really you're doing it through curating experts, right? You're curating it for your community. People can do that. Like, it doesn't have to be your LinkedIn. You can share other people's ideas. As long as your community finds it valuable, you're golden. Like, you don't have to sit there and come up with all of this IP, this intellectual property. Same thing with connectors. Some people are not macro people, man. They don't want to be out there with their brand. Like, that's not their game, but they're really good at connecting people. I have some people I really respect and value. They don't have a very public social profile, but they're the people that have made some really important referrals and connections because they're like, hey, Shama, I know so-and-so was looking for a PR firm. And I know that's what you like. I wanted to make the introduction. That in itself is also, right, leveraging social media. It's building community. It doesn't always have to be done on a macro scale. And I think that's an important thing to note.
Definitely. Curation is easier, a lot easier. And through curation, you can also create, right? Like, you get all this content, but curation helps you do a few things. One, I call it brand rub. I don't know if that's a word even, but you get the brand rub of somebody who has a higher influence than you just by the virtue of curating it. And if you do that consistently over time, like with us, we were competing with like Big 4 accounting firms. And then people started consistently seeing like, hey, these guys host events and webinars, and you got like big name, multi-billion-dollar CEOs coming to their events, and VCs and press. And so we started getting that brand rub, and we started building credibility, and then sort of it was visible, and then credible, and then profitable, right?
Yeah, you're talking about the halo effect pretty much. Your brand rub is the halo effect, right? So who you hang out with, like, you get a little bit of their halo. Yeah,
exactly. And so a few questions here around what KPIs then, because PR has gone so much from like disseminating a press release on PR Newswire to getting featured on like New York Times to TechCrunch, and today so much of PR is just creating influence with your audience. So you establish yourself as a thought leader, as a person of credibility, and when they're thinking of buying, they come to you. But what are the main KPIs when you're advising companies and clients that you suggest keeping track of?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say always choose the meaningful over the merely measurable, because the merely measurable looks good on paper. It doesn't always move the needle, especially when so much is happening in dark social, the things that we talked about. The things that I think are really good indicators of success. One is your share of voice. Your share of voice, this is a Nielsen-based metric, but what you look at is how much in your space, like your market, your market share, does your voice dominate versus your competitors? And we know this for a fact that whichever company has the highest market share also has the highest share of voice. So one absolute hands down way to increase market share is to increase your share of voice. The more people talk about you, the more people buy, right? The more people buy, the greater your market share. So this is really one of these key metrics, the share of voice, and just looking at how much do you own that conversation happening in your industry over your competitors. The other thing, which is such a simple one that everyone can just start looking at in their analytics, is branded searches. When you do this right, your branded searches go through the roof. Like people are searching for your company by name. They're searching for Traction Conference. They're searching for what you have to offer. They're not looking for something else and then kind of stumbling on. So the branded searches is another really good indicator that there is buzz happening in dark social that is now transferring to people finding you. And then the other part, this is going to sound so simple, but I promise I don't mean to be glib, but ask. I'm amazed at how many people don't just ask, like, how did you hear about us? Where did you hear it? Like, just ask people when they come for the demo, when they come for anything, just ask people on your contact forms, where did you hear about us? I don't recommend giving them a drop down because they'll just pick the first thing, or they'll choose Google if they just searched it. And sometimes it's convoluted. So they may be like, oh, my cousin told my friend who, okay, fine. Give them that space to tell the story, because you'll have at the end of the year, you'll have so much data that'll really tell you. Like, I'm always surprised. Our team tells me, they're like, we got so many leads or whatnot. They'll say, half of them said LinkedIn content. Like, that's where they've seen my content is LinkedIn, but there's no way to track that directly. Like, our software, the analytics doesn't show that. But if you just look at where people say they're finding us, we know where they're finding us.
That's great. So ask people simply at the simplest level, where do you find how did you find out about us? And you can integrate that into any forms, even for automation.
Yeah, and you should. So you have good qualitative data, not just the quantitative data.
Yeah. And then the other one you talked about is branded searches. I'd never thought about that, but it is important to check that out and see your influence, and maybe tied to it, even searches around your key terms and where you're showing up for those key terms and keywords, and
your
a lot of that stems with content.
Key executives too, Lloyd. Like, people are searching for your CEO's name, your CFO's. Like, if a lot of your PR is around those people, start looking for the branded searches around those individuals as well.
And what was the first thing you said?
Your share of voice.
Your share of voice. So how do you increase your share of voice?
Start getting more press, start getting more people talking about you, because share of voice looks at everything. It looks at people talking about you on social media, looks at how many articles mention your company name. So it's literally looking at how much conversation is happening in your industry, and they're speaking specifically about your company.
Definitely. Now, I want to take, actually, before we go into that, are there any good tools to measure your share of voice?
Yeah, I mean, there's tools. You can, like, Cision offers one, Meltwater. So there's different things that generally, as an agency, you have access to. You can definitely set them up. But again, even if you don't invest at that level, you can just look at your analytics for your branded searches and things like that. That alone will be great indicators of your share of voice.
Definitely. Now, I want to take the last few questions in rapid fire, right? And then we're past the top of the hour here. For a small DIY startup, outreach channels, how would you rate Instagram versus Facebook pages versus Twitter versus TikTok, kind of thing? There's a question here.
If I understand, I'm going to answer it as I understand it, which is like startup outreach, meaning outreach to whom, right? So if we're talking media, I would say Twitter, then Instagram. I don't know many people who check their Facebook pages, messages that regularly. So I would say Twitter and Instagram might be your best friends. But again, I don't recommend you do this cold. Make sure that you've been liking their tweets, engaging. Same with Instagram. Like, if they've seen your name pop up a few times, they're much more likely to engage with you than if you just message them cold.
Awesome. And another question here around, we're early stage product. We need to build credibility so that when people Google us, they know we're not a scam. If you're in that situation, what are some areas to focus on immediately now versus prioritize down the road? Like, how should one prioritize?
So if I understand it, someone's searching for this company to see if they're a potential scam. Is that the?
Yeah, if they're legit or not, given their early stage and don't have much of a digital footprint.
Yeah, then I would double down on press right away because you don't want that to balloon out of control, right? You want to make sure that you have because that means the good news there is people are already searching for the company. Like, they're actually curious. Curiosity is a wonderful thing, but you want to make sure that you are really leading that discussion. So when people search that, they're finding articles on you. They're finding things that allow them to do their homework and see that you are legit. we actually work with a lot of direct selling companies. So we end up facing this more often than not, just because with direct selling companies, a lot of the industry has been, tarnished by some bad players, but there's some great companies out there that they're doing great work. So they often have this kind of hurdle to face as well. It's not as uncommon.
Awesome. Well, that's all we had for today. One final question, maybe, as you look back at your journey, what do you wish you did more of, and what do you wish you did less of?
Oh my goodness. Great question. What I'll answer the latter first. What I wish I did less of is, I guess they're more or less the same. I'll say it this way, Lloyd. I wish that I'd said no more. I wish that I'd said no more to things that were not, that weren't moving the needle for me, and that I said yes to more of the things that might have seemed harder, but the payoff would have been better, right? So again, when I talk about consistency, I'm not immune. This is not like, look at me, superwoman here, been doing everything right for the decade plus. There's a lot of stuff that I wish that I had kept doubling down on and didn't take so many breaks or get, squirreled by something else. But we're human, and that happens. But yeah, that's what I would say is the same thing. I wish that I'd been better at taking my own advice right from the beginning. And the thing that I am glad that I've done is built our brand and invested in PR ourselves right from the start. I think that's a really important part of it.
Brands of tomorrow will be built on on influence, so you get started on that right away. I dropped a link to a number of books that you've written. I've dropped your Amazon link here. I think that's the right one that I just dropped right here.
Thank you. Yep.
Momentum, Zen of Social Media Marketing. There's a number of great books you've written. Outside of the ones you've written, what are some books that you recommend people read?
Oh man, I have a terrible habit of reading multiple books at a time, so I go through books very, very quickly. I'll give a slightly different piece of advice. I think it's really great to read outside the niche of what you do, because that's where you get the best ideas. I read a lot of historical fiction. I read a lot of I read a lot of history. I think history is so telling. And if you become a good student of history, you can become a better student of the future and predicting trends. I think part of the reason I have that sort of talent built over, kind of like what's next, is because I study history so closely. So that's sort of my recommendation. Isn't a particular book, but more broadly reading history, understanding where we come from, and reading things outside your area so you can really bring new ideas.
Awesome. The more leaders I speak to, the more they say building perspective outside of your core function is just good stewardship towards expanding your brain and just being stronger and better as a person and as an entrepreneur and as a professional. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Shama. It was a great pleasure.
Lloyd. I need some traction.